Thanks. So we're honored today to have Justice Josiah Coleman. He was elected to the Mississippi Supreme Court in November of 12 and started his term January of 13. He has practiced law in Tupelo and in Oxford, and he's the second member of his family to serve on the Supreme Court. Both his grandfather and his father were appellate court judges. He's the grandson of the late J.P. Coleman, who served as the Mississippi governor on the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. J.P. Coleman also served briefly as a justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court and resigned to accept an appointment as the state attorney general. Justice Coleman grew up in Choctaw County near Ackerman. He graduated valedictorian from Ackerman High School. He has worked at the Ackerman Piggly Wiggly, really interesting on his resume, and worked as a dishwasher, camp counselor, lifeguard while he pursued his undergraduate degree. And he went to, he earned his law degree. Excuse me, I lost my place. He served as a summer law clerk at a Tupelo firm, and after earning his law degree, he served for almost 2 years as a law clerk for the U.S. Magistrate Judge Allen Alexander in Oxford. He and his wife, Ashley Burt Coleman, have 3 children. They live in Fentress in Choctaw County on a farm that has been worked by 7 generations of the Coleman family. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to be here. First of all, can y'all hear me okay? Great. All right. Glad to hear that. I am here in Choctaw County speaking to y'all from home, and normally I'd have to warn you that this could be interrupted at any minute by crying, screaming, etc. from any one of my 3 children, but my bride has taken them, given this really wonderful turn in the weather. She has taken them across the road, and they're having a picnic in a pasture over there. So Lord willing, we'll get through this without too much emotional trauma. I want to really thank y'all for the opportunity to speak to you. I have learned in the almost now 8 years I've been on the court that people generally don't understand and don't have a working knowledge of what we do on the Mississippi Supreme Court. And so when I get the opportunity to speak to Rotary clubs, that's what I like to talk about, just to let y'all know what it is that we do. Because, you know, we in Mississippi, we were the first state in the country to elect as judges instead of appointing them. And of course, since then, more than 30 states now have some form of an election. But, you know, it's important, I think, since y'all vote on us, speaking of the election that's coming up, for y'all to understand what it is the court actually does. So that's why I want to take the chance to speak to y'all about today. There are 9 justices on your state Supreme Court, and there are 3 districts that elect those justices. So there are 3 justices elected from each district. The district from which I serve, the Northern District, includes 33 counties, all the way from the counties along the Tennessee state line south to Winston County and Atala County are the 2 southernmost counties. It's not exactly a straight line on that southern border, but it gives you an idea. As a member of the Mississippi Supreme Court and the other members of the Mississippi Supreme Court, we hear pretty much every type of case that there is to hear in Mississippi law, because pursuant to our Constitution, every appeal from a lower court has to come to the state Supreme Court. That's why back in the 90s, when it was taking 2, 3, 4 even years to get a decision from the Mississippi Supreme Court, and there were people that wanted to start a court of appeals, they had to figure out how to do it, because our Constitution doesn't allow an appeal to go to an immediate court of appeals. It has to come straight to us. And so that's why our court of appeals, when it was started, does not, if you look at a flow chart, doesn't exist below the Supreme Court. It's off to the side, because we take certain cases and send to them. But we hear direct appeals from circuit court, chancery court, sometimes county courts. We hear decisions from the Workers' Compensation Commission, which bypass the trial courts and come straight to us. So in addition to your civil litigation and your criminal appeals that we get from those, we also hear motions for post-conviction relief, which used to be called habeas corpus. And those are simply, once a person loses their criminal trial and gets convicted of a crime, they can make a direct appeal to us, or sometimes it ends up, a lot of times it ends up with the Court of Appeals. And on a direct appeal, all they get to do is point to what happened at the trial level. And they only get to bring to the appellate court the record from their criminal trial. And that's the direct appeal. But then later, if they lose their direct appeal, they can file a post-conviction relief, and at which point they can bring in matters from outside the trial. And so a lot of folks have heard of cases that have been reversed, convictions that have been reversed or at least questioned because of new DNA evidence. That's what you're talking about there. They'll file a petition with the Supreme Court saying they found new evidence, or we've had cases where people, a major witness will recant testimony. So they get to bring that to our attention, and then we will decide whether or not to let them proceed in the trial court. So that actually makes up a big percentage of what we spend our time on every day, these post-conviction relief motions. We also hear any bar complaints. Ultimate authority over attorney discipline lands with the Mississippi Supreme Court. And we also have the authority in the end to decide judicial discipline cases. So we spend time doing that. And finally, something that we do since the 70s, when the court decided a case called Newell versus State, is we draft and amend all of our rules of procedure for the court. So the rules of civil procedure, rules of evidence, those sorts of things. And so we have several committees on the court. I serve on the Civil Rules Committee. There's a Criminal Rules Committee. There is a committee that governs the rules of professional conduct, as well as the canon of judicial conduct. And so those are all divided up. That's something that about once a month we have rules committee meetings where we sit down and we try to look at motions to change those. That's another thing that takes up our time. And I mentioned earlier the Court of Appeals. There are 9 members of the Supreme Court. There are 10 members of the State Court of Appeals. And that's based on back in the 90s when that was passed, we had 5 congressmen. And so the Court of Appeals districts mirror what we had for our congressional districts back when we had 5 congressmen. Each district elects 2 judges to the Court of Appeals. So they have 10 members. We're all housed now in the same building in Jackson across High Street from the Capitol. But because we now have a Court of Appeals, it has been very effective in reducing the amount of time it takes to get an appellate decision. Like I said, back in the 90s or so, I've been told, I wasn't practicing law yet, it would take years to get a decision from the Mississippi Supreme Court. Well, now that we have this Court of Appeals that does so much of the work, we've been able to we have a 270-day deadline to decide appeals after the last brief is filed. And since we've had the Court of Appeals, we have been able to keep that regularly. And so it's been a big help to have them and to have that court. So to talk a little bit, just so that y'all will understand how this works, the interplay between the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. Like I said, every appeal comes directly to the Supreme Court. After that appeal comes to the Supreme Court, on the civil side, we have staff attorneys that look over the appeals, and they make recommendations to us on which ones we should send to the Court of Appeals. That's on the civil side. I think something like that was intended to happen on the criminal side, but it's never worked out that way just because we don't have the manpower to look at every single criminal appeal. So what ends up happening is you basically have a random system where we keep 1 out of every 5 criminal appeals, and the other 4 out of every 5 just go to the Court of Appeals. But on the civil side, we screen them. And then there are some cases that the Supreme Court has to retain that we cannot send to the Court of Appeals, such as death penalty cases. Every single death penalty direct appeal comes straight to the Supreme Court, and we consider those utility rate cases, city annexation cases, bond issues, election contests. Whenever a trial court holds that a state statute is unconstitutional, that comes straight to us and doesn't go to the Court of Appeals. The bar discipline matters I mentioned earlier, as well as judicial performance, those come to us. And then we also, sometimes the federal courts encounter a question of state law they don't have an answer for, and then they will ask what's called a certified question, and those come to us, to the Supreme Court. And so that gives you a little bit of idea of what we have to keep. We're also supposed to keep issues of first impression. which just means legal questions that haven't been answered yet are supposed to come to us. Other things we're supposed to keep. But that rather long list, that's the list of cases we are required to keep. And I don't think even, especially on Zoom, where it's impossible to make eye contact and it's a little bit different speaking, at the risk of putting people to sleep, I want to throw some statistics at you right here in the middle of the talk. But I think it's important for people to understand kind of how we're funded, the court system, the entire branch, and where that comes from. So, of course, the courts under our constitutional system are their own branch of government. They're the third branch of government. And our entire appropriation for all of the courts, not just the Supreme Court, but trial courts and everybody else, last year, fiscal year 2019, was $84 million. Of that, almost $49 million came from general funds. Another $800,000 came from capital expense funds, and there were another $34.5 million came from special funds. The reason we bring this up is to try to give some context for how much money the courts get from the state general fund. That $49 million from the general fund constitutes less than 1% of all the general fund appropriations for the state. So the entire court system, that entire branch of government, runs on less than 1% of all the general fund appropriations. In terms of how many cases we decided, there were 637 notices of appeal filed in 2019. So there were 637 notices of appeal, and if you count other types of cases that we get, there were a total of 697, so almost 700 new cases filed. The Supreme Court issued 142 opinions, published opinions that year in 2019. And this will give you, by the way, a really good look at how much work the Court of Appeals does. They issued 413. So we issued 142, they issued 413 opinions. In addition to our opinions, we decided 42 motions for rehearing, 150 petitions for certiorari, which you could file if you lose in the Court of Appeals. Kind of like the federal court, you could file a petition for certiorari and ask the Mississippi Supreme Court to look at what the Court of Appeals did. So we decided 150 of those, and 150 petitions for interlocutory appeal. And on average, talking about that 270-day deadline and the turnover or the amount of time it takes us to decide a case, on average, it took us 174 days from the date that the last brief was filed to the date that we issued our opinion. So that's a lot better than 3 or 4 years. And so there's some other things that the courts do and that I don't think people realize that we do. And I want to talk a little bit about those because I think it's important. Again, I mean, more so than the federal government, the people, the voters of the state of Mississippi have a say in what our courts do. I think it's important for y'all to understand what those things are. One thing that's part of the court system that's not so much what the Supreme Court does, is more in circuit, well, it's definitely in circuit courts, are the drug courts that we have. And, the drug courts, there's been a lot of talk in the past few years, national and state politics about criminal justice reform. Well, drug courts have been in Mississippi for a good long while now. And what that is it's just an alternative route for nonviolent and non-dealing offenses, people who commit offenses that aren't violent and don't involve dealing. It gives them, instead of going to prison, it's basically a treatment route. And I have some understanding of what it is, but essentially the people who are in that program have to submit to frequent drug testing to make sure they're staying clean. They have to work and they actually have to pay the expenses of the program. So it's a really good, strong program, because one reason I think it's a strong program is if you look at the recidivism rates for the population that just goes to jail and serves a sentence, you're looking at 70-something% of those people who reoffend and end up back in jail. And if you look at the drug court recidivism rate, it's closer to 20%. So you have a lot more success, according to the numbers that we've seen, in keeping people out of jail once they've gone through these intense treatment programs, so that they don't, it actually treats the addiction. And I'll tell you on a personal note too, I have been to a couple of different drug court graduations, and particularly in DeSoto County, which is one of the biggest drug courts that we have in the state. And when I have been, they will go through this. They will put on a screen, they will put the mugshot of the people who are that day graduating from the drug court. And I don't know how much, I'm not that familiar, I guess, thankfully, with drug addiction or what it does to people. But apparently, when you go through withdrawal, you itch. Anyway, these folks in their mugshots, they're emaciated, they're thin, their faces are broken out in scabs where they've been scratching. So they'll put that mugshot up there, and then they will take a more recent photograph of that particular person as they are finishing drug court. And at that point, the person in question has gained weight, their complexion is cleared up, and a lot of times they'll take these pictures with these folks as they've been reunited with their children or reunited with other members of their family. And I know it's a purely emotional hit. It doesn't really say much about the numbers, but it does say a lot and mean a lot when you're at these drug court graduations. You see that these folks have actually been able to go back to visit with their children and people that they otherwise would have lost. So I just want to mention that about drug courts. I mean, you can do your own research and make up your own minds. I think it's up to the legislators, to the extent we keep that. It's not up to the judicial branch to make that call, but I think it's something that y'all should be aware of, that your courts do. We also have veterans courts. Veterans courts are designed with the idea in mind that veterans that come into the courts, oftentimes due to their, especially combat veterans, will come in with different issues than the general population of folks. And so they try to make themselves aware of what those issues may be. And in particular, again, with drug issues and substance abuse issues, find help for people who have served our country. Another thing that we do, which is not particularly popular in Northeast Mississippi, and that's fine. I personally think that the counties can make this decision for themselves, but we have Mississippi electronic courts, which was being implemented with the idea that it will be more or less a statewide system that allows lawyers to file things electronically. And I can tell you from my time practicing law in Tupelo and Oxford before this was a thing, from the standpoint of the lawyers, it's got to be better than having to get in the car and race over, say, from Tupelo to Oxford to file something in the circuit clerk's office, at the last minute. This way you can file it electronically. You can actually sit at your desk and not have to drive and charge the client or do an expense report for the mileage to go and look up a file, because you can do that online. And so the idea is to have a statewide system where an attorney in Tupelo who may be handling a case down on the coast, which when I was in Oxford, I did a lot of Hurricane Katrina litigation down on the coast in federal court. And I can tell you, because back then the federal courts had the system in place, how much time and money, how much more efficient it was for me as an attorney and therefore for my client to have all of that stuff available electronically. We do some other court systems, does some other things as well. We have a court interpreter credentialing program. Of course, we have people who have to come into court in Mississippi that are not native English speakers. Of course, especially, growing number of Hispanic, Spanish speakers. On the Gulf Coast, there are a large number of people who speak Vietnamese. And so we have to have some kind of a program to certify folks to come into court and translate, so that those people can be in court and be understood, their testimony can be understood, the jury can understand what they're saying. So we have a program that does that. We also have something known as the Access to Justice Commission. A while back, in 2006, we started realizing, I wasn't on the court yet. I was still 6 years away from being on the court at that point, but the thought started going around the realization started being reached that we had a lot of people in Mississippi that had to be in court, particularly in chancery court, with custody battles, divorces, et cetera, that couldn't afford attorneys. They had a hard time getting to court. They had a hard time understanding what was happening when they got there. And so in 2006, the court created the Access to Justice Commission to try to find ways to help folks in that situation when they come into court. The commission has 21 voting members. It is co-chaired by Chancellor Mask, Jacqueline Mask, and of Tupelo, and former bar president Roger Wilder of Gulfport. So they chair it. And then some of the things that commission does, I know I've been to one of these in Pontotoc County. They will have their members, especially the Chancery Court judges, work on having pro se law clinics. In 2019, the pro se law clinics met with and provided help for over 1,000 people in our state that needed help in Chancery Court. And so basically what they do is they get local lawyers to come into the courthouse, and they advertise it, and they ask these people who have these certain matters. It's not available for every legal issue, but for uncontested divorces and other other matters that are ex parte, these folks can come in and ask for help from these attorneys. And the last thing I want to mention is the Commission on Children's Justice, which was formed recently with just the aim of that group. That commission is to improve the court's involvement with the child welfare system. You know, over the past few years, we've had an increasing awareness in Mississippi of the needs of juveniles in our courts. There, you know, we've had some legislative action on that. We have tried to make the youth courts and the county courts and the chancery courts, where there are no county courts, more responsive to the needs of especially children who are in abusive situations or in situations of neglect, where those children can be reached more quickly. And that's what that commission tries to do, is help the court system figure that out. Again, you get in a lot of these things, access to justice and children's justice issues, you get a lot of interplay between what the legislature does and what the courts do. And we're fairly limited in what we can do, but we can look for ways to make things more efficient so that these folks can get better help. And so I hope that what I've been through was helpful and instructive to y'all in understanding what we do for y'all down in Jackson. And I just want to close by expressing to y'all as citizens of the Northern District how much of a honor and privilege it has been for me for the past 8 years to serve on the court. It has been a challenge, but one that I have enjoyed. I am very much a nerd. And what I do on a daily basis is talk to my law clerks and talk to the other justices, debate, research, read, write about what the correct view of the law is. And it has been a real joy for me to be able to do that. And just say that I think we have a really good court, really good staff down in Jackson working for y'all. And so if there's anybody who's an educator, or if any of y'all have groups that you bring down to Jackson to tour the Capitol, don't forget us across the street. If you contact me, I can certainly arrange for a tour of the courthouse where we sit. Is the only courthouse in the state of Mississippi that serves the entire state and not just a county or part of a county. So we'd love to see you down there. We can arrange tours, for me to come, or some other justice to come speak to y'all if you have school groups or whoever. Last thing I want to mention is that we actually live cast, and we're starting to have more oral arguments picking up from where we were, where we kind of stopped with the coronavirus. We broadcast or live cast all of our oral arguments online. And so if you go to our webpage, you can easily Google Mississippi Supreme Court, go to our webpage, you'll see a listing of any upcoming oral arguments. We try to make it a point on the Mississippi Supreme Court to be open to the rest of the state, and open so that people can see what we're doing. We live cast our arguments. Mississippi College School of Law archives those arguments. We try to, as much as possible, unless a case involves a minor or for some reason needs to be sealed to protect somebody, we try to make sure the cases are open so the public can know what we're doing. So with that, I will close. I appreciate again the chance to be here to speak with y'all today. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Justice Coleman. Appreciate you being here. We'll open it up to questions. Well, while everybody's looking for that mute button, I'll ask you a question. Not to get into the political comment, but give us your feedbacks about what's happening in the United States with a Supreme Court opening 5 weeks before an election, just high level, not to be partisan.
I think that I mean, obviously I think it's going to really add fire to that political debate that I'm going to try not to get into as I address that. I think that under our Constitution, you have different roles in place for a reason. And I think that under our Constitution, the president, whoever that may be at any given moment, if he or she is president, they can make that appointment. I don't think that would be an illegitimate thing under the Constitution itself. Now, I think for political reasons or reasons of just congeniality, it may not be the time, but that authority legally is there. But also at that point, you've got a U.S. Senate that has to decide what to do with its constitutional role to consent to that nomination. And so from a strictly constitutional perspective, I think that there can be a nomination made. But I think that you just have competing interests here in the what can be done and what should be done spirit. I'm not going to speak to that, but it will be interesting to see how it plays out. I understand that. I think I read something somewhere this morning briefly about the stock market maybe not having very much fun with this for sure. But all I know is it's going to add fuel to the fire for sure. And I guess I'll just sit on the sidelines with the rest of y'all, wait and see what happens.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think too. It's going to be interesting to watch the last 5 weeks play out. So, all right, who else has some questions?
Randy McCoy here. I have a question for Justice Coleman. Justice, do you, as a Supreme Court, get your appeals every day, or is there a set time period? And then once you have them, do you only hear information from the record, or do you take new information into your decision making?
On a direct appeal, they come in. So a direct appeal is started by the aggrieved party filing a notice of appeal. Those make their way to the Supreme Court, and then the clerk dockets them and gives them a number in the order in which they are received. And then in the order in which they are received, they are assigned to us as justices based on seniority. Everything at the Mississippi Supreme Court, including who serves as your Chief Justice, is decided by seniority. So that's how they come in to us. And then on the second part of your question, I'm trying to think if there are any exceptions. On a direct appeal, we only look at what's in the record. We only look at what's in the record. The attorneys are only supposed to argue about what's in the record. And in fact, on a typical direct appeal, and I just can't think off the top of my head any exceptions to this. As soon as an attorney tries to argue a matter outside the record, they get shut down pretty quickly. Like I was saying earlier, in criminal matters, you get something after your direct appeal where you can bring in matters from outside the record. And other than, that's about the only thing I can think of. Now, in judicial performance matters and in bar discipline matters, those strictly speaking are not appeals. So in those, we are making the record in front of the Supreme Court. So those are a little different. So I hope that answered your question. And by the way, I tell people this all the time. It's not very often where you get to be the one asking me questions. So please do ask. I would like the chance to answer any that you might have.
Hi, Dr. Strange here. So this is not related to judicial issues. Just curiosity. Have you heard of Ware, Mississippi? Because I know you're from the big city of Ackerman.
I live between Ackerman and Ware.
I used to go to school in Ware.
Really?
Yeah, sure did. Way back in the day.
Yeah, my mother taught high school in Ackerman and Ware. She would teach in Ackerman for 3 class periods every morning, and then the lunch class period she would drive over to Ware and then finish off the day there every single day. And she would teach. She taught several different subjects. So for 3 class periods in Ackerman, she would teach French and German and Latin and physics and calculus and anatomy and physiology and a couple of other things. And then she would go to Ware. So this was back in the 80s when computers were coming on the scene. And so I remember being in her fourth year French class in the corner of one classroom, and then there'd be a calculus class going over there. So she would program, she would write her own computer programs to be able
Wow.
to teach kids to do all these different things at once. And by doing that, she was able to bring a lot of different subjects to Ackerman and Ware that I don't think we otherwise would have had. So yes, I'm very familiar with Ware. It's a great little town.
That's a coincidence. It's nice to have somebody with your character in office.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Justice Coleman, this is Tom Booth.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, I don't know how deep you want to get into the weeds here, but I would love your brief thoughts about our Mississippi prison system. You talked about the rate of people who don't go through the drug court coming back out and having problems again. And I don't want to put you in a bad situation, but I'd love any quick thoughts you had on that.
Sure. I think drug courts have been effective. I wanted to share those numbers with y'all. But especially in this past year, there has been a big political debate over criminal justice reform. There was a bill passed, Governor Reeves vetoed it. And I hate to do this to you, but from the standpoint, all these things can end up being litigated in the Mississippi Supreme Court. And while, and I want to be really careful not to say anything that would tend to make me look like I favor one thing over the other, because if it comes before the court, that puts me in a position where somebody could ask me to recuse, saying I've already prejudged the issue. All I will say, I've answered this question before just by saying that as a judge, I'm a big believer in the separation of powers, and as of right now, that issue is one for the legislature and the governor. And I don't want to basically say anything that could lead to recusal motions later on the merits of that particular of the litigation that's been proposed. I'm sorry, the legislation that's been proposed. So I hate to do this, but I'm going to have to punt that one.
Understand completely.
I don't like punting questions, but if you and I were alone having coffee, I could get more into it, I think. But publicly, I need to kind of stay away from that. I'm happy to answer any other questions, though, or try to, or tell you I can't.
This is Zell. I wanted to ask if being a Justice Supreme Judge was a goal of yours following in your family's tradition, or is it something that just happened? Can you talk about that and how you feel about carrying on that legacy?
Sure. I was a senior in high school when my grandfather had a stroke that ended up killing him months later. But so I knew him. The reason I bring this is just say I knew him growing up. I have memories of when he was on the Fifth Circuit and we'd go to New Orleans. My older brothers were big enough to make those trips with him. I never got to go. So I definitely was aware of what he did. And then of course I know my father, who's still living. And I will say, I'll put it this way. I grew up with that awareness. I did not get the desire or feel like this was a calling until later in life when I was in law school. And at that point, I got really interested because, you had these competing schools of thought on how the Constitution and statutes should be interpreted. They're I learned this word recently. They're called the modalities of interpretation, textualism, living constitution, all those things. And I got really interested in that in law school and started trying to figure out for myself what I thought was the most valid method of doing this. And so that's when I would say that the real desire to one day be where I am kicked in. I did not expect, so I did not expect to get there when I did, as early as I did. I was 39 years old 8 years ago when I was campaigning. It's funny, when I was elected on November 6, 2012, that was mine and my wife's second wedding anniversary. So we got to celebrate our wedding anniversary me sitting at a computer like this one, clicking the refresh button on the election results all night. And then this year, the election's on my birthday, so go figure. But anyway, so I got into the race when I did because for a strange set of circumstances, and I don't need to necessarily get into that, except to say I didn't necessarily anticipate being on the Supreme Court when I was 40. But I'm glad I have been, because all the things that I thought that kind of motivated me to want to have the job have been there from the standpoint of this is what we do. So it's been very rewarding. But I definitely learned a lot of broader principles from my grandfather and father that don't just apply to being a judge. They apply across the board to a lot of different things that I think have served, that I think have made me better at what I do. And by the way, my mother taught me a lot too. I can't leave her out. She was obviously, with her education and her work, very influential as well.
I was going to say, she made you the person that you are.
Oh, she, my dad was when he was in college, he majored in, if I can remember correctly, Latin, literature, and political science. My mom was she had a PhD, or has a PhD. She still has it, in biophysics. And so my dad was kind of the liberal arts, literature side, and then my mom was definitely the scientist. And so both of them had their influence.
Any other questions for Justice Coleman? Well, Justice Coleman, thank you. I have a text message from Eddie Rester, a friend of yours who's now our pastor at our church. He said to tell you hello, and
Good
to see you in court, but he said hello. So
all right, well, I'll need to get to Oxford and see him soon.
Yeah, he's doing well. He's doing well. All right, real quick, thank you for our guests and members. We appreciate you coming today.